Hi, I'm Mike, the executive producer of Crimson Peak Records and beatmaker slash producer at ThatMikeRivers Uh, Today and over the coming weeks, we're going to be looking at some of the tracks we've released on our label, doing mix breakdowns and production overviews of some of my favorite tracks, and the ones that I have access to, like the stems and all that. If you want to see some of our artists sessions, I can uh, put in the request. But for now, you're just gonna have to stick with the stuff I've personally touched. Um, Hopefully, by now you've heard some of our tracks. If you haven't, please go listen to them on Spotify. I like them a lot, and we put a lot of effort into them. So, specifically with some of the tracks I've worked on, we've spent a lot of time exploring creative avenues and doing some outside the box production that I think may be of interest to both producers and non-producers. I think this video series will be a good way of seeing how records are made, and specifically how some of the more alternative styles of production, how far you can push it while still sounding, moderately okay. Today we're looking at a track called Running, Run It, featuring Komorebi and Legoman, Melbourne rappers slash vocalists who graciously volunteered their vocals for this track from the L.A Beatniks. It's a drum and bass slash UK revival track, UK jungle revival track. I would say it's breakbeat and two-steppy, but also footworky inspired. It's definitely not your standard drum and bass track. It's got a lot of driving rhythms and sort of interesting vocal chops and things. I think it's a good place to start because it was the first record released on our label back in August 2019. Yeah, something like that. Last year, more or less. And this video series is well timed because we're coming up on our 1 year anniversary. Anyway, I'm going to play through the track in case you haven't heard it, and just to refresh our minds on what it sounds like. There's two caveats I think we should talk about before we begin. The first is that this is the raw mix session for this track. So this is, wow, there's a lot of plugins. This is a basic overview of what the final mix sounded like with some tweaks and all that. The first thing is that these, as you can see, are bus stems. Now, why don't we have the individual kick, snare, etc., bass, the vocal takes and all that? So the original Ableton session for this file is long gone. Like, I'm talking like 3-4 years ago, hard drive failure, irrecoverable, is that a word? Unrecoverable files. It's gone. It's dusted. These are stems from the Pro Tools mix of that Ableton session. So this is a mix of a mix, in fact. Luckily, we found the bus stems that I bounced out of Pro Tools. I think I still have the original Pro Tools session, but that is why this is more or less a bus mix, which means that all of the instruments are grouped into their sort of categories and then mixed from there. The second caveat is that you're hearing the rough mix through crazy two-bus chain here. That's pretty ridiculous. We'll have to go and have a look at that. This is a mix from a couple of years ago before. I mean, hopefully I've gotten better since then, but you can really tell where my head was at back in the day with all the crazy plugins. This is the mix before it's handed off to our mastering engineer, Luca, who basically saves all the tracks that I mix. Your mastering engineer will often take a mix that sounds okay and, it's all right, but he'll turn it in, or they will turn it into something that is palatable for Spotify listening. All right, I think with those two big caveats addressed, we can listen to the song the whole way through, and then sort of go track by track and sort of break down some of the cool production things and maybe some light mix analysis. So let's have a listen. I really hope my computer can run this.
Give me some ganja. Track man.
All right. So, if that was the first time you've ever heard that track, I would suggest going and listening to the final version on Spotify for the master and how it flows into Horizons, the B-side to the single. So I don't know if you caught that at the end as well. It's something I realized that over time I've corrected this in a lot of mixes, that a lot of these plugins have noise modeling and virtual hiss and things like that. That's something that I corrected over time, but I remember when we got the master back for this track, specifically in sections like the start with the Rhodes and at the end, that when you bring the gain up to make it competitive, which I've done here for your listening pleasure, but in the original mix I didn't actually... I mix quite low and then I turn my volume up so that our mastering engineer is happy and doesn't want to kill me when I clip the master channels. That white noise gets amplified like 10 or 20 times over or whatever until it's just like a hiss of white noise. And we'll see in Horizons that can be a cool effect in and of itself, but be wary about that if you're using vintage modeled plugins. So I think we can go track by track from the top down, and generally I layer these in order of importance when I'm mixing. So I go drums, bass, vocals, some type of lead element. Usually these would be synths, but here it's the Rhodes, to a pad or like a sort of space-filling element, and then finally the effects. The effects is just this sort of one-channel pumping thing in this track. Now, you may have seen that when I brought up this window, this is the automation window where you can control things like overtime, parameters and things like that. There's a lot of froze and pans and things like that. That's a really integral part of this track, but I think we'll go through and we'll talk about some of the philosophy behind the production. So this track sort of started as a drum-driven. I would classify it as UK jungle, but I mean, you may have a different opinion. It's definitely out there. But the idea came when we were messing around with these vocals, which, so these are vocal chops from a song that was unreleased. To this day, it's unreleased. If you do enough digging, you could probably find out about it, but I'm not going to reveal too much about it. Basically, we were given the vocal stems to that song to do a remix of it or something like that. And I was playing around with these vocal chops, which you hear throughout the song. I'll solo them. And you can hear they're really heavily affected and really heavily chopped up in the Ableton sampler. Now, the whole idea of this song, and Horizons to an extent, was the idea of using vocal chops as a sort of rhythmic device. So when the vocal chops are sort of on beat or they're put through an arpeggiator or something like that, they become a rhythmic element more than... they have melodic notes, you can pick out phrases, but it was really using the human voice as an instrument. And in fact, like, though the drums are very standard sort of cut-up break beats, obviously for sampling reasons I can't tell you where these drums came from, but if you know about drum and bass or UK jungle production, you could probably tell where these drums came from. The drums are sort of doubling the rhythm of the vocal cuts. It's sort of working backwards in that sort of way. Usually you do the drums, you do the bass, and you do the vocals. But this is a very vocal-driven song. And it was sort of using the vocals, cutting them up, and arranging them in rhythmic ways so that you could sort of pick out words and phrases here and there. And I like having like little motifs and things come back in the vocals, a phrase or a word repeated. That's more apparent in Horizons, that sort of audio trickery where if you hear a word over and over and over and over and over and over again, it sort of like has your brain does this weird thing where you can't really distinguish it anymore. It sort of just blends into this one mess. I really like that idea, and we use that to great effect over there. Specifically, down here at the end of the song, Komorebi here is looped saying the words. The A, like, I think it's 72 or something times. And you can hear how, so the word is, the way it's pronounced, the consonant of the word becomes a sort of like, almost like a hi-hat in the way that it's a galloping, driving sort of figure. And when you layer that in with the rest of the song, it really sort of pushes it along. Now, as I was saying, these are not representative at all of the song they came from, considering they were chopped up and screwed up, filtered, and so on. So, you know, this is probably the only time you will hear these vocals. But yeah, let's start from the drums. So, normal, standard procedure for drum and bass / jungle. You get a break, you cut it up, you kicks on one, snares on twos, standard affair. But the really cool stuff happens down here. I'll play you some of the standard pattern. Yeah, not very exciting. But the cool stuff happens over time where the drums get layered. So, in fact, in Ableton, there's multiple drum kits playing this sample. So you program in the MIDI, and then you duplicate it, and you add in the little embellishments, the hats, snares, almost as if there are multiple drummers playing the same drum kit. Over here, gets more, you add more layers, change the pattern up a bit. Now that's more of an extended loop rather than a cut up sample chopped to the transient as you would in Ableton. It's run through auto filters and auto panners. You can see the waveform moving up and down like that. It's a very washy section that allows the vocal to become the main percussive element. So you can hear when he says way, it's a very chesty sort of bark, and that sort of becomes your kicker, your snare, the transient information that sort of would ground you on the ones and the threes or whatever, you know, the beat, the downbeat. So the drums here step back and the vocals step up as the main percussive element. Down here, you can see that this galloping snare roll is mirrored from the kicks and snares up here and sort of drawn out. That's this element, which is a sort of like rhythmic motif throughout the song, comes back later, is really drawn from footwork, where the drums are very sparse and very minimal, but they have a lot of snare rolls and sort of sharp, attacky 16th note hits, all layered on a little on the bar before the next section. I find that really cool. So I call them like machine gun snare rolls. I think a lot of people do, in fact. But I used it on the vocal chop to mirror the drum percussion to really reinforce that sort of vocals as rhythmic element thing. So again, filtering the drums, which are playing more of a standard pattern. I do a lot of stuff here, dropping the drums out before the section continues in the way that a DJ would at his mixer. Sorry, excuse me. A DJ would at his mixer, and he, drops that out, filter sweeps, stuff like that. So you can hear now we're layering the cut up drums from the start with a more fully fledged loop that's sort of playing in time. And it's really focused in on those cymbals being as washy and sort of smeared as possible in a way. The important thing is that the snares really bite through, so that whenever you have that snare roll thing, it really comes to the front of the mix. Like, I'll play it for you here. It's sort of, the arrangement is such that there's a little gap at the end of every bar where the snares can really punch through. Yeah, right there. You can hear that little galloping fill there. That's just macro arrangement stuff, just making sure that the tails of the roads, die out and there's a little gap there. Sort of keeps the momentum going. You can hear as well, this vocal is doing a similar thing. So you can hear the word drop here is on the twos. So on if you bring the drums in here, it usually hits when the snare hits. And yes, I am aware that the vocals don't sound great in isolation with all the effects and the weird smearing and stuff, but really, I guess it's a tonally thematic thing. Make it as weird as possible. Really not. It's not gonna win, best pop vocal production for clean vocals or whatever. And that's on purpose. It's to sort of make the voice more of an instrument than to be recognizable. This is almost directly a footwork drum pattern. I hope you're picking up this rhythmic motif now. It's like been introduced way back here, and it keeps going throughout the whole track. It's very Portishead machine gunny. So here's the really... We'll come back to the section a lot in detail, but this halftime drum thing is really important for delineating it from... Oh, there we go. Thought so. So this was produced on a big 27-inch iMac with like a lot of processors and stuff like that. This is just a MacBook, so hopefully those system errors don't show up that much. So this is where the drums really become layered. This is everything all at once. The drum loops, the chops, everything. It was really important to get that snare punchy and the kick sort of very tight. And then we bring back the layered filtered cymbals. And you can see them moving around in the spectrum. They're like panning. Some chops and stuff. And doing some arrangement pieces where one layer will play, then it will cut out, then the next layer will play and it will cut out. So it creates this sort of like DJ cut and scratch type thing. And that's used in the arrangement here as well. You can see it pyramid down almost, like you have the drums, then the bass cuts out, here the Rhodes cuts out, the pad cuts out, the effects cuts out, and it creates this stepped motion. With panning as well, this creates a little bit of ear candy just for the last break. That's more or less the drums. It's just a lot of layers. It's a lot of effects and auto panning. I would have liked to have shown the original Ableton cuts and stuff, but you know, it is what it is. So moving down to the bass next, this was at a time where I struggled a lot with bass, getting that low end to really knock and so on, and that's why if you look at some of the stems, there's just a lot of processing going on. We can look at those in depth later. I won't unfreeze it for the sake of my computer, but there's a lot of processing and audio trickery to get it. So the main thing with this type of genre is that the drum and bass need to be super solid. Like if your drum and bass don't work in isolation, then the whole thing is like ruined. So this bass is a really, really simple pattern. It's almost just the root note. I really hope you're listening on good speakers or headphones, because you're not going to hear that over an iPhone speaker or whatever. So the bass really is just laying down that root note. But you can see from the waveform that it's heavily sidechained. So usually this would just be an 808 with a long drawn out tail, like a blah, you know, something really, really boring. So the real sort of movement that this is given in the song is from that sidechain from the drums. You can see wherever there's a kick, the volume turns. That creates the wavy sort of texture. That repeats throughout almost the entire song until, you know, it gets some variation. It goes like up a third and a fifth. Not the most musically complex thing in the world. You see, because there's no kick, there's no sidechain here. Which works for this section of the song because it becomes more wide and sparse. But of course, it's back to the drums and bass here. And then again over here. Nothing too crazy. That's more or less it. It just hits the root note. I thought it was important not to do anything too melodically crazy with the bass, so that the elements that are playing more chords and harmonically rich stuff could be filled out, could fill out the song. It really is just hammering home that center point so that everything is in reference to that note ringing out. Especially with these vocals, which there are some melodic stuff. Usually that's in opposition to the bass ringing at the root note, creating a nice interval. Okay, the fun stuff. This is a vocal supplied by Komorebi, who's, hopefully you've heard a lot of his stuff by now. It's been really chopped up, ridiculously chopped up, almost unrecognizable. If you can pick out what he says, then more power to you. You can write in the comments or send me a message or something what you think the lyrics to this song are. They can be the official lyrics if you want. Basically, the vocals in this song really are a rhythmic element more than anything else.
Give me some ganja.
Okay, that one, you know what that says, but for copyright reasons, we won't say. So even here, you can see that although there's already a lot of stuff going on, it's important to give things movement by doing some panning and throw delays and stuff like that, because at its core, if you stripped away all the reverbs and sends and stuff like that, it would be a very boring vocal. It would just sort of hit the one, and that's baked in. All of that's baked into the file. You got to give it some width, so really extend that tail. I don't know. Maybe it's just a bit of fiddling around when there's no D2, but I like to give things width with delays and stuff like that. We'll come to the sends in a little bit, because this is a very, very reverb heavy track. I think almost everything is sent to a reverb track to give it a lot of space. That's why I thought it was important to keep the bass and the drums really tight and dry to an extent, so that there's space for reverbs and a little bit of width. Apart from the sort of chops and rhythms and stuff, there's not much to say about this vocal other than I kept a lot of the sort of pops and transient-y elements of the chop to really nail down that rhythmic nature of the vocal. So that's not good practice in audio. You should probably crossfade your vocals, but when you layer it with the drums, and you of course make it in time, you quantize it, I think you probably don't notice. You think it's just a drum element. Legoman's vocals, another Melbourne rapper. So there's a lot of pitchiness, there's a lot of transient info, and there's a lot of filters. And again, the vocals are distorted and transformed and stuff, but you can still pick out words here and there, and that's where the title of the song came from, Run It, is that you hear the word run it, and it's just repeated over and over and over. Almost like a hook in pop songwriting.
Shit is real.
accentuated by actual lyrics as well. Not again, not the most pop vocal driven song, but it is what it is. It's cool. This Rhodes, funnily enough, for how amazing it sounds, not to throw shade, is the Ableton stock electric piano. I know, right? But the cool thing with the Ableton stock piano is that if you hit it with a certain velocity, it creates this transient, plucky sound. I don't know how to describe it other than the fact that it almost has a bell-type quality. And it really depends how hard you hit it. So it's very, very velocity sensitive, the samples they use. Now, that combined with the delay really shapes the first half and the end of the song. Because there's no chord being held down. You can sort of make out the notes, but it's more of that initial pluck that we're interested in. Now, this Rhodes over here, you can hear it actually has chordal information. But at the start and end of every bar, it's hit specifically again in a sort of way, almost like you're whacking it. You're giving it a good thwack, and it rings out this pluck. When you send that to a delay, that becomes a rhythmic element in and of itself. It's very crunchy as well. You can hear it really apparent there. And it was just sort of finding a way. Yeah, again. So same Rhodes piano, same chain. Like in Ableton, this is all one track. It's literally when you hit the piano with different velocity, with different strength of you hitting the keys, it will produce a different tone. Probably similar to how a real Rhodes would. So you can hear this one has a lot of new harmonic information. It's also heavily tremolated. Almost like a Wurlitzer in a way. And I could not tell you these chords if you paid me, because I cannot remember them. Some panning here. We'll get into the automation in a bit. But I really wanted to hone in on that 60s, 70s rock organ Wurlitzer sound, a bit like the Doors, some soul. That's used to greater effect in Horizons than it is in this song, but the Rhodes plays an essential part here as well. Goes up and down the register. Do some cuts there, and it's the outro of the song as well. Specifically because of this little percussive hit. I think it's the white noise is way more apparent at the end of the song. Some people say that having the white noise helps the listener. I don't know. So psychoacoustics makes the song quote unquote sound better because of old analog tape. I don't know. Some crazy forum knowledge. Who knows? To me that just sounds bad. So this pad is tucked quite down in the mix, but it helps. I don't know if you can hear that. It has a lot of stereo width information. It really sounds like it's pushed to the sides of the speakers. Now this is a choir pad, almost like a mellotron, because you can sort of hear the tape wind on it. And it's very low in the mix. It's a supporting element more than anything else, and it's also been heavily sidechained, so you can hear it pumping and breathing with the kick. That's to, number one, make room for the kick, obviously. But number two, it gives it that swirling motion that this song has a lot of, where it's always stumbling forwards. This becomes more like a traditional soul pad here, ringing out chords. Big, long reverb tails, sidechain. This is more of a effect like a crash that's been heavily reverbed. You can also hear it pumping as well. Now that's wide. And we'll see why that's effective in a little bit. Here it rings out like a triangle wave type lead, just sort of reinforcing that interval with the bass. So at first glance the song seems like quite straightforward melodically speaking, but there is some nice interplay between the intervals. There's a lot of harmonic information. The effects, nothing too fancy. That sounds like a percussive loop that's been sidechained and tremolated, probably, Santoy's tremolator, to give it a bit of pumping motion and reinforce that rolling, galloping feel. You probably couldn't hear that in the mix if it's, you probably couldn't pick it out, but it does play intervals, so that's gone up an octave now. And it's moving around, so there we go once again. Oof, it really does not like this. I think it's time to look at some of the cool little ear candy stuff that happens in the song. So, if we press the A key to bring up the automation screen. So this is everything you see in yellow is automation for volume, which means like making the quiet parts loud, making loud parts quiet, just keeping everything in check. This is a standard mix sort of thing. Panning is used more creatively. So you can hear how the vocal elements here are happening at the same time. You have legs, then come up, then legs. We threw them out to the left. Here. So that they move around the stereo field. Now that's a concept that's used quite a lot in this track, is that you don't really want your elements to stay in the same place all the time, even if they're panned like super wide. Because like I remember reading this once, that if everything is in stereo, then nothing is. So you've really got to, and I know that sounds counterintuitive, but it sort of makes sense in a way. Maybe not. But it's keeping the ear interested, because if you hear the same thing over and over and over and over again, then your brain sort of just like tunes it out almost. So the panning is used to greater effect here when it switches to the half tone. The Rhodes has always been down the middle. But now it's like, whoa. And when we come back, it's like, yeah, this is where it needs to be. It's just to wake you up a bit, Now, I know it's probably not good practice to hard pan your drums left and right, especially the kick. You can actually hear the kick move as well, because these are bus stems. The fact it lands back here, straight down the middle for the snare roll, now that means we're back to a quote-unquote normal part of the song. This is for the main drop of the song as well. You really, if you want this one to hit hard, you've got to do some cool stuff before it, you know? In terms of panning, that's more or less it. But, so this is tangentially related to panning. Stereo width is a really important part of this track. That's why you have the pads. That's why you have, you know, the effects like thrown out. This is something that I do a lot, is that to really accentuate a section, you will collapse or expand the stereo field, which means the space in between your monitors. If you have a single monitor, that's mono, obviously. If you have two speakers, that's stereo. And the space between the two speakers where you hear sound is called the stereo width. Now, I don't have an audio engineering degree, so maybe I'm completely wrong. That's how I interpret it. When I want to delineate a section as being like, okay, something really cool is about to happen, I generally either clap something to mono or make it super wide, or both. And we're going to see when you use both in the song. So here, just pay attention to, and if you're listening on a mono speaker, this isn't going to make sense at all. But pay attention to what the stereo field is doing. Now, I don't know if you heard that, but basically when the snares are rolling through, it sounds like they're coming directly straight in the middle of the field. The same principle applies over here. So we have the cool panny bit. And so, you know, higher values mean larger stereo field, and lower means the opposite. So hopefully you heard that. It feels like the stereo field just got massive. And it has a textural element as well, where things sort of get thinned out a little bit. But I'll play this again, and you can watch this sort of diagram so you can mentally follow along. And back to normal. The juxtaposition of having it straight down the middle and then super wide is what gives this drop a lot of its character. So if I had bypassed all of that and we do the same thing, you can hear the difference. I mean, it's still cool, but it's not. Which is a neat little trick. If you take away nothing, then take away that. That's more or less it for the track in general. If you look at it in terms of a waveform, you'll notice that a lot of the elements move around. So there's quite long sections, like a good 16 bars of just having no bass and just the drums. And I think it's important to not just draw out elements for too long. You know, have the Rhodes come in the start, take it out. Keep the composition very varied. And there's also a lot of mini drops in this song. So although that one that we just looked at can be considered the main drop in the song, it's important to have like little elements, little moments of excitement. Like there. Or when the bass comes back in here. And because it's been gone for so long, that's really shocking to the bass come back. You're like, whoa, I forgot all about this. Same thing over here, same thing over here. So that's more or less it for the arrangement side of things. You don't want to know all this. I quickly learned in the months following this that sometimes less is more when it comes to processing. A lot of you will look at that and, be disgusted. But trust me, I every day is a learning experience. So, you know, even these sends, there's a lot of stuff going to each of the stems. Almost every element goes to some type of reverb, which we'll solo all of the verbs all at once. Using different forms of reverbs for different elements. So the plate verb I use on vocals, chamber verbs I use on pads and Rhodes, and whole verb I use on like effects and synths and stuff to one it out. You gotta have sort of different spaces for different elements. So some people use like one room for everything to give it a sort of grounded, as if they were all recorded in the same space. I think for music like this, you got to play to each of the reverb strengths. So some of the cool sends that are in this song, you might have noticed, is this thing. So this is actually, this is called the bass translator. Now I'm going to solo the bass. So as you can hear, that's just a sine wave, more or less, and it's pumping along. The bass translator is a concept I use to make this translate onto phone speakers and laptop speakers. So it uses harmonic generation devices or synthesizers, such as the Brainworks subsynth or the R-bass, the max bass from Waves, to generate harmonic content above the register of the bass. So this one is 56 to 80, which gives more harmonics in that range. I don't know if it's a harmonic exciter, but that's how I think of it. The max bass gives it above 80, so about 80 to, that'd be like 500-ish, I suppose. And those are the ranges that your speakers are producing, because a phone speaker is not producing 30 hertz, which is what this sine bass probably is, something ludicrous. This one as well, 180 hertz, giving it a bit more of a kick up in that register. This solely exists, this bass translator solely exists for translating the bass to speakers and laptops. You don't necessarily need this if your original bass has information in those frequencies. For this specific instance, it was a drum and bass bass. Well, it was like a low ND bass for subwoofers. Now, I mean, it'd be great if everyone had a subwoofer at all times, but most people don't. So this is for the people... Oh, I'm just going to quickly activate this. Huh. Okay. Well, that's interesting. I actually own this, but whatever. That's fine. So this Ampeg is a real bass cab simulator. It models the circuitry of a real bass cab. Why this is used in my bass translator is to, number one, give it a little bit of the sound of a real bass tab, but number two, give it a real world feel, as if it was retracked or remiked into a bass cab captured in a room. To have this on a send that's really low in the mix, like I think the send is something along the lines of, what was that, minus 30-ish dBs. Probably not useful and costs me a lot of CPU power, but I'm going to turn it off and on, and you hear the difference. So this is the bass translator. And you can hear there's a lot more harmonic information. I'm going to turn the bass cab off. Maybe you can hear that, maybe you can't, maybe I'm crazy, I don't know. There might be a volume mismatch, who knows, but I think it does something. Distortion as well is useful for getting your bass to sound a bit more present, and a bit of compression at the end. So this is the bass with and without the bass translator. Sounds like a sine wave. And here's it with. Adds a lot of harmonics, a lot of harmonic information, and that helps the bass come through in a very dense, buried mix. Next is the drum parallel. This just gives it a bit of whack, so a little bit of distortion. This is a distressor, so you can tell I'm pretty heavy-handed with my processing. That's a 76 clone, the 77, MC77. And it has a transient designer for punch. The vocal grit bus does what it says. Gives it grit. All of these are mixed very conservatively, so they're very down in the mix, and probably you can hear it. And let's turn it off. Again, I don't know if that's just me, being crazy or whatever, but I can hear a difference. And it really, for this type of music, I really wanted those vocals to sound grimy and to punch through. Different verbs. Here's a room. I like to send my drums to a room. That's just me. The plate verb is used for smoothing out things. The chamber verb is used for width. The whole verb is used for a different type of width. Slap delays, tape delays, which are like, I'm big into delays. I don't know. This track is very delay heavy. And throw delays, which used to sort of extend the lifespan of that vocal. The two-bus is a probable disaster, I would say. Has a console emulator. So, funnily enough, I use the Focusrite. See, that's the thing. When I was doing this mix, Brainworks had come out with all of these cool new plugins, and I was like, oh, I gotta try this on my mix. Maybe these days I would use like an E or a G bus or something like that. Maybe even the UAD version, but who knows? This plugin is the Alex Hilton A1 stereo control that's used for stereo width. Virtual mix rack used to model the G desk, the SSL G desk, some console pre emulation, and a little bit of this shelving boosts to the lows and highs. This is a EQ with a lot of roll off. That's a lot of getting a lot of gunk from the lows of the sides. The Moog is a parametric EQ type thing with a crazy knob for sub, which is like below 40 hertz. So this is to be used in moderation, and their crazy 40 hertz shelf, which is nice for adding some air. After that is the Dangerous Backs Master EQ. This is really good for gentle boosts up at around 7.1. I would have done 18, but that's the thing with looking back on mixes. You often want to change things in retrospect. And the API at 2500 bus comp. I love this compressor so much. The Townhouse bus compressor, sort of like a G bus from SSL. I don't know. I just really like the way it glues everything together. Here's it out, and here's it in. Very cool. And this Pro L is never, I'm not printing that and giving that to my mastering engineer. That's just adding 9 dBs of gain, because that's how quiet I mix. Mixing down fader. I will say that probably that's not the best idea, considering the plugins use a expected input gain level. If they're analog modeled, they expect you to use, I think it's -18. I'm not sure the exact number, but they expect you used a certain amount of input to get the right harmonics and characteristics of the circuitry. But that is more or less the mix and some of the production philosophy behind Run It by the L.A Beatniks, featuring Komorebi and Legoman. I hope that at least, this was mildly interesting and you picked up one or two tips and saw that, you don't have to be the best mix engineer in the world to have an alright sounding master. Your mastering engineer will suffer for your sins, as it were. Okay, so that was that side of the single. Next, we're going to do Horizons and then forward through the catalog. So yeah, see you in the next one.